Which camera should I be looking at?
All of them.
Oh, sure, yeah, okay. This fantastic camera's got both of you.
Okay.
This other one has a nice profile image of Joe with prop in the background.
Okay.
So you want that one.
You want to look straight into the closest one as menacingly as possible. Yes.
Okay. Weird.
They've all seen Roaster's Guild. They know what it's like. Roaster's Guild.
Okay.
All right, let's do a 10. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3.
Hello, welcome to Mill City Roasters Minneroasta event here in Minnesota. We're coming to you live on YouTube once again. This time it's not a roaster school though, it's a giant event. We have, I don't even know how many people out here in a live audience. And I'm here with my good buddy Rob Hoos, who is an author, who is a very experienced roaster who goes around the world basically and teaches people about roasting coffee. And more than teaches them, coaches them on how to perfect their craft in a lot of different areas other than just specifically making that coffee brown. Rob, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So we are also brought to you today by a few sponsors, which I'm going to read off for you. Pacific Foods Barista Series has donated a ton of milks, which we have in the back, and we're going to have an event this weekend where we're going to do a coffee triangulation, where we're going to taste different coffees through different milks and different milks through the same coffee and see what we can pick out. So a huge thank you to them. We also have some prizes from Baratza for the competitions that we have this week. Roast Magazine is going to be in the house. They're going to be covering our event and posting about that on the Daily Coffee News. We also have Cafe Imports, who I work for. That's my day job. So if you ever want to get a hold of me, you want to get a hold of me at Cafe Imports. Bueller also, which is a roaster manufacturer here in Minnesota, and Mill City Roasters, of course, which is our main host of this event. So thank you all so much. If you want to find out more about this event, if you want to still fly in and make it out to our events tomorrow, you can go to www.minneroasta.com for all of that. So we're going to dig right in. Also, you can follow along on Instagram. Please follow Mill City Roasters on Instagram. It's just at Mill City Roasters. So we would love to have your likes on there, your comments on our pictures, and have you join us in all sorts of media. So we're going to have a conversation today about roasting, and I'm going to kind of be panning over here to the audience. So don't feel left out. You're part of the audience too. But you all have paid your way to travel here from all over the globe, and we're so glad to have you here. We're going to spend some time talking to Rob about coffee. I have some questions for Rob, and I'm sure that you all have some questions. Are we taking live questions on the live feed at all? All right, so if you're at home watching this, you can also ask us questions. So, Rob.
Yes.
You wrote a manifesto about roasting coffee, right? So I'm sure that there was a point in time where you were roasting and you were just like, man, I just have to get out some information about roasting. What inspired you to write a book about roasting?
So the biggest bit of it for me was I started roasting in Cincinnati, Ohio, and felt fairly isolated. The business I worked for didn't really have the money to send me to any events, and I didn't have enough money to send myself to any events. And so one of the major impetuses for starting the whole research project was I saved up enough to buy a 1 kilo roaster and just started doing experiments. Tried to break down the roast profile as well as I could into identifiable segments and see what happened if I changed only one of those segments, and to just learn on my own, and then cupped and cupped and cupped and repeated and repeated and repeated. And the reason I put it out as a book and tried to keep the price as low as possible was because it needs to be accessible for everybody, because I can easily identify with people who just feel like they are on an island and not able to connect with the greater community to learn.
Definitely.
So, yeah.
And historically, roasting has been kind of that island. Most roasters historically have been really isolated and don't really have a community to go to. The Roaster Guild has done a lot to change that. You know, we have tried to bring more and more roasters together to share information, and events like this are moving the needle on that too. But it really starts with people who are geeky enough to explore and open enough to share what they're learning and share what they don't quite know yet.
Yeah.
So I appreciate your book for the honesty that it brings to the table, but then also saying this is a conversation. This is not the end all be all. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
So basically, where was your roaster? Was it in your garage or in your basement? Or
So at first it was in my house, and then it was, well, no, sorry, it ended up at my work.
okay,
So
cool.
my boss just let me have a table basically and let me keep running the place there.
Your mad scientist lab.
Yep, got in trouble for keeping it a little too messy a few times. He'd come out and be like, this is kind of a disaster. I was like, yeah, that's fair.
This is my brain. Don't mess with my
exactly.
brain. I love it.
So,
So Rob, when you step up to a new roaster, which I know that you do often because you travel around and roast with different people, when you face that new roaster, what are the most important things that you go to? How do you wrangle that roaster in a very fast way?
yeah. First thing I look at is Fahrenheit or Celsius,
Okay.
because I've made that mistake a few times. God, it shouldn't be this dark quite yet. Oh, wait. Whoops. No, but just kind of getting an eye for the safety features, first of all, making sure you know where the emergency stop is, if the roaster has an emergency stop, or where power shutoff is. Finding your fire extinguishers, because no matter how experienced you are, if it's a foreign setup, like that you're not used to, you never know what could potentially happen, or if there's some sort of cleaning step that the client is missing. Then I look at the thermocouple thickness, so I'll actually start going around and checking out the thermocouples. They're asked to look at their graphs, usually from charts, whether it be Artisan, Cropster, or Typica, or whatever. You can kind of get an idea from turnaround about how thick their thermocouple probes are, so you get an idea as to how it's going to operate. Look at airflow controls, burner setup, all that sort of thing, and then usually do just kind of like a test batch. Hopefully they've got a bean that's not too expensive for them, or I'll watch them roast a couple times until I get a feel. That way they don't waste any production coffee, and then usually I'm about ready to step in after that. So.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, when you jump on a new roaster, it's kind of like getting in a new car that you haven't driven before. You need to take a moment, figure out where the dials are, figure out how the steering works, where's your e-brake, things like that. Yeah.
Well, ventilation setup can be so different too. You could be totally familiar with that particular model of roasting machine, and if the ventilation setup's totally different, it just functions differently.
Absolutely.
Which is a pain. So.
Cool.
Yeah.
And so when you step up to a new coffee, say there's an origin that you've never seen before or roasted before, or a new processing method from an origin that you're familiar with, how do you troubleshoot that and get to the lowest common denominator fast?
So first thing is I ask what I'm using this coffee for. So if this is a coffee that I'm trying to purchase for my dark roasts or my blends or what have you, or single origin light roast, coffee that we all kind of geek out on probably the most, then what I'm really doing is first of all trying to determine, okay, why am I actually trying to buy this coffee? Because that's going to influence a lot about how I'm going to approach it. Usually when I'm going through the process of sample roasting to buy a coffee, I take diligent notes while sample roasting. Sample roasting is going to give you a really great indicator as to how that coffee may or may not react when you actually get it into a larger roaster and start doing some profiling or something like that. So usually on the back of the sample card, I'm writing down, okay, when was pale, yellow, brown, first crack, drop. And then I'll take notes like if I'm starting to go into first crack and it's just not really happening too terribly quickly, then I'll write down something like this coffee dogged around first crack, may need higher heat. If it just tries to take off on me, I'll notate that. All of this while doing sample roasting. Then if that's a coffee I decide to buy, I take that sample roast notation and put it in my file so that when the coffee actually arrives, I've kind of got a starting point. And pairing that roasting note with the tasting notes that we actually get off the coffee gives me an idea of kind of where to start. So, I know, well, this coffee was super bright and I had a minute and 50-second development time. So maybe I need to tone it down just a little bit more. So maybe I'm going to start my profiling with a 2-minute development time, that sort of stuff. So really use your sample roasting not just to evaluate whether or not a coffee is clean or something you want to purchase, but use it to actually characterize how a coffee will tend to operate. And then that'll get you a really nice head start in terms of actually doing the profiling. Then you just start doing the profiling based on where you intend to use that coffee in your product line. If it's going to be a dark roast coffee and that's what you're buying it for, there's not necessarily a ton of reasons to start with it really, really light because, first of all, we run businesses, right? And we're buying coffees for certain reasons. And unless you have a coffee that just comes out absolutely stellar and you decide, okay, I'm going to pull an audible and switch that up and actually use that for something else and find a different coffee to use in that blender or different roast level, then you're usually starting there. So
Yeah. And I would add to that that the more similar your sample roaster is to your production roaster, the easier that learning curve is going to be. If you have a sample roaster, quote unquote, sample roaster, that is more of like a home roaster that doesn't have a lot of controls, then if it's only there to turn coffee brown for green evaluation, you're not going to have a lot of impact into how you're going to take that coffee and put it into production. But if you have a machine that allows you to have all of the same controls, at least some of the same controls, then you're able to take that information and very easily apply it to your production system. So that's one of the reasons why I love the fact that Mill City has the 500 gram that has the exact same controls as the larger. And I'm not trying to plug Mill City, even though we're here right now. But truly, that is just such a brilliant tool that you can use because it has the exact same controls. You can just take that information and go with it on your larger machines.
Yeah.
So
what I would recommend too, when you do sample roasting, there's a really pretty big trend right now to just sample roast faster and faster. And there's a dilemma with that because, and this is maybe where I'll express a little bit of a heretical viewpoint, but coffee to me tastes the way it tastes, not because of the particular machine it's been roasted on, but because of the pathways that coffee takes through chemical reactions and physical changes. If you roast a coffee on your sample roaster in 4 minutes and fall in love with that coffee, you're likely never going to reproduce a 4-minute roast on your actual production roaster. And so you could fall in love with the coffee and then just be totally dissatisfied with it after it lands and never really get to what you thought the potential of that coffee was. But it's because you're evaluating it in a way that's completely unachievable on your main machine. So we try and keep our sample roast closer to 9 or 10 minutes because we can realistically do that. So if I'm sourcing a light roast single origin coffee, I'm making sure to keep my sample roast within a reasonable similar time frame to my actual production roaster so that I'm not just completely dissatisfied when I bring a coffee in and realize I'm going to either be stuck doing 20-pound batches on a 35-kilo machine to get it to go fast enough, or that I just won't get what I wanted out of that particular coffee.
yeah, and a soapbox of mine is use your importer for what your importer does best. And generally, that should be, for a viable importer, vetting coffees for defect. So if you are looking only for defect in coffee, then that's where doing a super light, super fast roast is needed. But if you're vetting a coffee to see whether you're going to buy it to put it into your production, then you want to vet that coffee, like Rob is saying, in a way that makes sense for your production. Will this fit? Does this satisfy the hole that we have in our lineup, or does it not? The importer has already looked for defects, so having a trusted importer that you can go to and say, is this defect free? What did you find in it? What did you score it? And then you get the sample and put it into a sample roast that is similar to how you're going to produce that coffee. Then you know, is this coffee going to work for what I need it to work for, or is it not? And you can't really do that if you have a very different type of roaster than you have in your production lineup.
Should we say something crazy?
Please.
Should you sample roast dark for dark roasted coffees in your lineup and taste it at approximate roast level?
Absolutely.
What?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I don't like the approach of, okay, so this coffee is this on a sample roast, it's going to automatically be great as espresso. I know that because I'm an experienced roaster. No, you don't. You don't actually know that until you actually taste it as espresso. There are always tricks. There are always things that coffee's such a dynamic, weird thing. The closer you can approximate that sample that you have to the use that you will use it for, the better it is. Why would you try to sample roast a coffee that you're going to roast dark light? It's just like a waste of time in many regards, especially if your importer has already done that work for you. So yeah, use the coffee in the way that you think it's going to be used, see if it's going to work for that purpose, and then there's no guesswork. Then you can automatically put it into that position with confidence, and you don't have to now reinvent the wheel again after you've vetted the coffee. Now you have to reinvent the wheel, and then you put it into production. That's just a waste of time. And time is money as a roaster, right? Especially for those of you that are roaster owners, You're trying to do the roasting, you're trying to do the sales, you're trying to do your books, you're trying to do all of this other stuff. Spending a lot of time on these extra steps that are not needed just because it's a trend in the industry doesn't make sense to your business, in my opinion. I saw a hand go up. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have a question about sample roasting. If you don't have a sample roaster, we do all our samples on the production 12 kilo. It takes about 9 minutes or so. Do you have any recommendations for doing something on that instead? Or it's pretty much blocked by wire?
No, I mean, so
I'm going to repeat the question
Oh,
so
yeah.
people at home can hear the question.
there you go.
So the question is, they have a production roaster. It's a 12 kilo machine, and they're trying to do a sample roast on a 12 kilo machine. So they're doing very, very small amount of coffee in a very large machine. They're trying to stretch that sample out to 9 minutes. Is this a good thing? Is this best practice or not a best practice? What is your recommendation?
So I do a lot of sample roasting, 200 gram samples on a 3 kilo, which is not quite maybe as extreme, but you can figure out a way to have really nice set points by monitoring your exhaust air temperature, because obviously your bean probe doesn't mean anything at that point. The beans aren't even covering it. But by monitoring your exhaust air temperature, you have an idea of how much heat you're applying to the coffee. And so, like, for example, and this won't translate for you at all, but just to give you an idea of how I do it at work. So I know that on my 3 kilo with my airflow maxed out and my drum speed maxed out, the reason the drum speed's maxed out is because my tryer literally won't catch any beans if it isn't, because of where the tryer is located. So with those two maxed out, I know that if I keep my exhaust air temperature at about 400 degrees until about 3 minutes, so it'll do a little dip. So I'll charge to 400, let it dip, let it come back up to 400 by about 3 minutes. By about 6 minutes, I'm trying to be at like 410. By 9 minutes, I'm trying to be at about 420, 430, and usually that's about where I hit crack, and then I give it 2 minutes development for an 11-minute sample roast because that's kind of close to where we do a lot of our production roasting. So by actually profiling it off the exhaust air temperature, while it's not quite as accurate as doing it off bean, I can track color changes, and I can track when crack happens, and actually it's usually a little bit quicker. So I'll almost always hit yellow at 4, brown at 5. First usually happens about 8 minutes in, and then about 2 minutes development after that. And what I'm doing at that point is just listening for crack. You want crack to continue to happen at a nice, slow, steady pace without it ending or without it accelerating too rapidly. So you're just kind of using physical characteristics and sights and sounds and smells to really drive it. But once you have a protocol down, it works fairly well. So it's definitely something you can do. It may not be the best, but it works in a pinch, that's for sure. And until you can get a sample roaster where you can just do a lot of development, like profile development in small batches, it does work for evaluation. Yeah.
And I'm gonna approach that from the other side of the equation and say that you should have a sample roaster. If you're wanting to do sample roasts, you should have a sample roaster, because even still, if you don't have a machine that has all of those controls, like most machines don't have an exhaust temperature, most machines don't have the ability to change drum speed. So if you don't have those controls, then you're totally flying in the dark, and you're relying only on the end point of that coffee. And if you're relying only on the end point of coffees that you've never tasted in any other format, then how do you know that you're actually evaluating the coffee to the best of its ability? I know that from my perspective as an importer, when I'm selling coffee to customers and they're using that kind of a method of evaluation, they're passing on very high quality coffees regularly, because they're not getting all of the flavor out of that coffee that could be there. So I encourage you, if you want to truly evaluate coffee well, get the right tool for the right job. I know that that's a cost though. So in the meantime, figuring out, like what Rob is saying, some kind of a way to roast coffee consistently is great, but know that you're probably going to miss some opportunities with that. Yes?
Question.
Mhm.
So the difference between the exhaust as well as the environment temperature, can you repeat those time points you try to hit when measuring the exhaust?
Yeah, two totally different names for the same thing.
Okay.
So exhaust, environment, return air. Is there any others? Ambient, not ambient. Air temp. Yeah. Well, it wouldn't be the natural gas. It'd just be like the air. Basically, as the air is exiting the drum, Yeah, so that's kind of what that's measuring. But the idea behind it is if everything in front of that everything in front of that air mass is at the same temperature, then the exhaust should be about the same. So that's kind of the theoretical construct on it. And for the timing, I would tell you again, but I'm also concerned I don't want you to use that because for your machine it could be entirely different. But I can tell it just for reference.
Yeah.
So once again, 3 minutes, I'm back up to my charge temp of 400 on my particular machine, which is a 3 kilo USRC. But with my ventilation setup, it's like straight out, so it might be different for different ventilation setups. 6 minutes, I'm at the next higher temperature limit. And then 9 minutes, I'm at my final temperature limit. And then after that, I'm adjusting, or whenever first crack starts happening, I'm adjusting the gas dynamically as I'm hearing crack.
Because I can go through an entire roast and just be at 400 degrees and not really, if I were to go higher than that, I would just kind of keep climbing.
Yeah, and every roaster is different in that way. So part of it's due to thermocouple placement, part of it's due to roaster design, stuff like that. So for example, I could tell you end temperatures that would blow your mind on either side. One roaster that I was on, we had second crack happening at 408 Fahrenheit. My roaster that I roast on at work now has a 16th inch thermocouple, and it's the same roaster that we were hitting 408 second crack. I'm hitting second crack at 450, just a different thermocouple. So one of the things to keep in mind, if we ever mention temperatures, and this is why and people were a little bit bothered by it when I didn't mention any temperatures hardly in the book or really anything other than time, is because it's so variable depending on where your roaster has the thermocouple set up, what the thicknesses and the gauges of those thermocouples are, what type they are, whether they're J, K, whether it's a RTD or it's an actual thermocouple, or if it's a thermometer that's using physical expansion of a material. So all of those things play into it. So you could have two thermocouples, and then there's also manufacturer specs, which are plus or minus 4. So you could have an 8-degree temperature difference between two of the exact same thermocouple, just from how it's engineered by the actual manufacturers that make the thermocouples. So there's a lot of variability.
Is there a difference in the cup?
Is there a difference in the cup between
408 and 450?
Oh, no, they were literally measuring the exact same roast.
So two probes, two different kinds of probes in the drum at the same time. So you roast the coffee, one coffee, two totally different profile curves.
Yep.
You drop the coffee out, it's the coffee that you roasted. The profiles look vastly different, but the coffee's just the coffee. So chemical reactions don't care what kind of probe you use.
Yeah.
Chemical reactions don't care what your profile looks like. Chemical reaction is going to happen. So your probe is there as a reference point for you to go back to your machine and say, okay, this reaction happened here, this coffee tastes like this reaction happened here. How does that look on my profile with my system, with my probe? That's why I hate it whenever I see, I'll just be really honest. Those of you at home, I'll be really honest with you. I know you expect no less. I hate it when I see a probe posted online and somebody comment, ooh, nice, or a profile posted online, nice profile. Oh, that's a gorgeous profile. No, it's not. It's just like, it's reference. It's reference. It's like looking at a map and saying, oh, nice route that you took to get to that destination.
Yeah.
It doesn't make
Which
any
sometimes,
sense.
though,
Yeah.
on the maps. No, but Joe's absolutely right. With profiles, you can't look at what anybody else is doing and make a direct one-to-one comparison to what you're doing. It just doesn't work that way. And so the few times I have posted curves before, people are like, you're ending at what temperature? And I'm like, calm down. It's all good. It's all good. Or like it would be on fire in their machine. Like I've roasted coffees on machines up to 495 Fahrenheit. Now that would be on fire in most people's machines, but with this thermocouple and where it was placed, it was really dark, but it was not on fire. So everything kind of is for your own personal reference and for your consistency within your own roasting operation. And the only way to really communicate to each other is about relative color change and what time that's happening. It's like, oh, I hit yellow at this, brown at this, first at this, dropped out at this color at this time. And other than really giving those notes, there's no real way to do comparisons between roasts. And as much as that may sound problematic, that's really the best that we have at this particular point in our industry, because it's not possible to standardize across all of them.
That's right. Yeah, so there's a big trend out there right now that I see of profile shaming. Don't feel shamed. Don't feel shamed.
I'm unfamiliar with this.
Yeah, I mean, especially on your home roaster blogs and stuff where people are really myopic on a profile and the way that the curve looks. Forget about it. If it tastes good, that your profile is great. You know, don't let somebody shame you on a profile if they haven't tasted what you've roasted.
Yep.
That's what's in the cup is what matters. At the same time, there's a lot of profile affirmation, and there are some guys out there and gals out there who always get praised for their profiles because they're just drawing a line with their roaster. They're using their roaster like an etch-a-sketch for the profile, and it's not an etch-a-sketch. It's a tool to turn coffee into a drinkable substance. So forget about how beautiful a profile looks. Now, Rob, one of the things I did want to dig into with you is you recently wrote an article for Roast Magazine, one of our sponsors, and you talked about thermocouples in terms of profiles and kind of fleshed all of this out. And there was some backlash maybe online. Some people didn't really think that was.
No,
I
there
want
was
to hear
only
your perspectives. So, what brought you to writing that article? How has the response been, and how do we move the conversation forward from here?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few reasons that I wrote that article. One of them being that something that I consistently see is kind of what Joe is describing with this whole profile shaming and ideas. A lot of people don't understand the amount of nuance in the data that a profile is, that a bean probe thermocouple profile is actually showing you, because they make a lot of assumptions about what certain things mean. And part of the goal was for me to help people lose. So, all right, I'll start with the bigger frame here. Years ago, I was very frustrated that people were not taking a scientific, rigid, dogmatic approach to roasting. And everybody's like, I'm an artist. And it's like, cool. You don't feel like an artist like 6 Italian roasts into the day, and you know you've got the next one to do, and then you're going to switch and do 7 of your production for your espresso, right? You feel a little bit more like a production roaster. I mean, most of us don't feel like artists on a day-to-day basis. We get to be artists when we source new coffees, design new profiles, that sort of stuff. But then we're production people beyond that. And people were trying to be artistic with every single batch, and there was just no consistency. And so that was a big frustration of mine. And in recent year and a half, I feel like the pendulum has swung to the other direction, but it's too far away from center again, where people are like looking at little blips in thermocouple readings and freaking out, or blips in ROR and freaking out. And I don't think that's healthy either.
Exactly.
Because we are roasting an organic compound. That organic compound is a very, very complex reactor in and of itself. Just to kind of like give you an idea, and we'll go through some of this in depth later on, you're applying heat to the outside of the bean through convection, conduction, radiation. That bean is then diffusing the heat into its core. As it's diffusing the heat, there is a pressure wall being generated because the water vapor is trying to evaporate, but can't evaporate and leave the cell fast enough. As fast as it's being produced, it's actually producing pressure. One bit of research done by Illy and Vivaldi cite that's 25 atmospheres of pressure potential inside of a coffee. An espresso machine has 9 atmospheres or 9 bars. So 25 bars potential pressure inside the coffee.
It's like thousands of pounds per square inch.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah.
And as this pressure is being formed, the heat is still trying to penetrate to the core, and the water is carrying some of that heat out through the latent heat of vaporization to the surface and is acting as cooling. So it's being heated and cooled simultaneously and pressurized. And every seed that's in your drum is actually different from all the other seeds around it because of growing conditions, how ripe it was when it was harvested, subtle nuances, maybe different cultivars, slight different altitudes, and different plots of land that the coffee was actually collected from. And this is what we're trying to measure with a metal stick, right? And we all know that metal is a bit thermally conductive. Does metal have a pressure wall being formed? Does it have water evaporating, causing cooling on the surface a little bit? No, it's metal. It heats up, right? And so if we look at a thermocouple measurement, does it give us a good enough idea that we can be repeatable and consistent? Yes. if that thermocouple does something weird, should we assume that the coffee, which has a lot more thermal inertia, both in terms of it takes it longer to actually get going and it takes it longer to slow down. My thermocouple cools off a hell of a lot faster than my coffee does in my cooling tray, you know what I'm saying? Right? So how should I expect that this little metal thing, if there's a little bit of an oddity to it, is going to cause my coffee to be ruined? And I know people that if they have a blip in their coffee, they will literally pitch it out and not even taste it. They're like, it's ruined, and they're done with it. Which to me is insane.
It is insane.
I can make my thermocouple on my 3 kilo. What I can do is I can roast so fast in the first part, because the thermocouple doesn't just read the beans, right? What else does it read? Air temp, wall of the drum, depending on how close or far away it is. You've got radiation, you've got all this stuff. So it's reading multiple things. On my little one, I can go so fast up to first crack, I can get a negative 12 degree per minute rate of rise and still have the coffee positively cracking and getting darker. Because what happens is I've heated the thermocouple beyond where the coffee actually is, so my thermocouple is actually way higher than my coffee. When I turn my burner down and I'm starting to slow down, suddenly it starts to try and catch up with where the coffee actually is, because the heat in the air has actually been changed. So it's not a straightforward thing, and my real goal in writing that article was just to help people understand, like, first of all, everybody chill the heck out, right? Cup your coffees, but also understand that what we're seeing isn't exactly what's happening to the coffee. It's probably a bit smoother of a gradient than that. You're not going to turn your burner down and suddenly the coffee's like, yeah, I'm done heating. No, it's going to be a lot more gradual than that. It's going to be a really gradual let off, and then it might finally start to decline. So we went from not caring enough or thinking that we're just totally artists to all of a sudden caring too much. And I just wanted to highlight the nuances of that for people so they wouldn't, first of all, feel shame for any profiles that they may or may not be doing. If it cups out well, also, people that may hate on your coffee online aren't your customer. And I always want to highlight that for people. Like, that's cool that you don't think my coffee would taste great, having never tasted it. But I don't actually care what you think.
Exactly.
Because I'm selling 380,000 pounds a year to people that actually like it. And we're helping our farmers have a better way of life. And we're enjoying ourselves along the road, right? So all of that being said, so the follow-up to that, what is the pushback that's kind of come from that? Actually, everybody's been super positive, which has been wonderful. The only discussion we've had is I've had private and public conversations with a number of other people who operate other data logging software that were frustrated I didn't use their data logging software, which is fine. So that was pretty much the extent of it. And it ended by basically us saying, hey, Twitter's a really bad place to have any meaningful conversation, period. So let's meet and have a beer next time we're around each other, and we can talk about this for 3 hours. But I basically don't engage with anybody online because it's pointless. I'd rather sit, have a beer, look you face to face, especially if you're going to have a disagreement. So, but yeah, that's been the only pushback. And I think next steps are really like figuring out how do we actually accurately measure the bean temperature, because that's not something I want to give up on. There's some interesting stuff with real-time color monitoring happening. People are experimenting with infrared thermometers now, which is very interesting to me as well. They all have their own drawbacks and downsides. With real-time color meter, it's a known fact that all the beans aren't the same color, so you get a lot of noise in that. And with the infrared, the temperature and density of the air mass above the infrared thermometer actually plays a huge impact in how that's reading the coffee too. So there's no real good way to do it unless we're doing what they do in some of the scientific studies where you drill a really tiny hole, put a really small thermocouple in there, and you put one on the surface, and you put it between layers of glass mesh to hold it together, and then blast it with hot air. But it would take a long time for us to roast that way. And I don't think our customers would get it or care. Yeah, long-winded, sorry.
At the end of the day, our customers are way more forgiving than we give them credit for sometimes. We're always going to be our hardest critic as a roaster community. So keep that in mind too. Accept the forgiveness that your customers offer for those things that are maybe a little off profile. Also remember that your temperature probe is not there to tell you how to roast this batch. It's there to tell you how to repeat the batch that you roasted. Yeah. So you're gathering information from the coffee, you record that information, and then that gives you a roadmap of how to best get back to that same place. So on your system with your coffee, your curve will get you basically the same results as it got you the time before. But even then, if you follow the curve exactly, there's going to be some variance, and that's okay. This thing that we're working with, like he said, is organic. It's so varied, and it's changing all of the time. It's a living thing. So we've got to accept that change and understand that there's room for variation, and that variation is not error. Variation is dynamics, and that's something that we should all be celebrating, is the variation from one coffee to another.
Can I throw a few more wrenches in this?
Oh, please.
Sweet.
Throw 'em.
So here's some other fun stuff to consider. First of all is our own mentality when we cup. I did a really, really fun experiment. Some of you might have actually gotten to get in on this 2 years ago, I think. But basically, I sent out 5 coffees blind to people. They just had codes on them, okay? And the 5 coffees, it was a decent, like 84-point Colombian coffee from what I remember. And I sent them out to people, and I said, cup these and fill out this form and send me your results, which sent it out to 100 people. 100 people cupped it. Over 50 gave me responses, which is great for just a free survey. What was really intriguing was because there were 5, and there's 5 different experiments in my book, everybody assumed that I was doing the book experiments. And so they assumed every one of the coffees was a different profile. And so when they cupped it, every one of the coffees had different scores, different attributes, all that sort of stuff. Do you know what's really fun? 3 of the coffees were bang on the same out of the same cooling tray. Like same exact roast, pulled out of the same cooling tray, packaged it. The other 2 were close. One was a 7-point color track spread, which I did intentionally to see if anybody would pick up on that. Out of the 52 responses I got, and a lot of them were actually Q graders as well. So it wasn't just that they were slouches in terms of being able to taste. Only 4 people scored the 3 coffees within 1 point of each other. And I took out all the defects. So I allowed them to score for defects, but when I did the totals, I basically said clean cup, sweetness, and uniformity are out, so that if they did get something wrong, then it wouldn't impact the score. And any defects they subtracted are out. So it was literally just the positive attributes, and the descriptors were different, the scores were different, and only 4 people got within 1 point. I think only 8 got within 2 points, and everybody else was wildly different. And what it shows is the mentality that you come at a cupping with is going to inform almost more about what happens than anything else. So like, you might think, oh, I messed up this roast, I need to cup it. And you might cup it and be like, see, I did mess up the roast. What you need is somebody to set up a blind triangulation for you, where you do 3 sets of the coffee, and you have to properly identify the messed up batch in all 3 sets. And if you can't do it, it's not there. It's just in your head. And if somebody else sets it up for you and you're blind to it, then that's awesome. The other thing with all this profile talk and how it's not uniform, and this is going to be, these are some of my very fun things I like to do. So do you brew your coffee at the same ratio you cup it? Everybody doing 18 to 1? No, right? Higher, right? A lot of people brew with higher. Do you want to know what's crazy? We actually roast for our coffee to water ratio. And what you're doing in your QA/QC lab is going to inform how your coffee tastes, because you will make roast changes based on how you cup, and that's going to impact that. So we actually made a choice, or I made a choice at my company in Portland to switch to cupping at our brew ratio, because I wasn't happy with what was coming off of our Fetcos, or buns, or we have like 5 different types of brewers in the field. I wasn't happy with how it was tasting brewed in a batch brewer, right? So what I made the decision to do was, well, I'm going to start cupping it at our batch brew ratio, and now the coffees taste smoking off our batch brew. But it's because I'm roasting for that coffee to water ratio. The other kind of wrench to throw in this system is your water is uniquely yours in your area. How many people here can convince their wholesale accounts to install a $5,000 RO system that then has a remineralizer built in the other side? Anybody? Yeah, I can't either. I can't even convince my own lab people to do that. So your water is unique for you. And the other truth is, what is the biggest amount of content in your cupping bowl when you're cupping? It's your water. And so you actually roast for your water too. So in Portland, Oregon, we're at about 22 parts per million. So we're damn near distilled water. Just as a quick reference, I don't know the full spec sheet on our water. I apologize for that. I'm not sure what the calcium hardness is or anything like that. But anyway, that's all a moot point. If you take our coffee, which doesn't get to see minerals very often, and minerals helped with extraction. If you take our coffee and you cup it on SCA standard spec water, which is 150 parts per million, there are more minerals to act as solvents for the compounds in our coffee, and so we actually get a heavier extraction. So what I'll taste on my water is being bright, fruity, light, floral, juicy, actually comes out as a little bit roasty on SCA spec water. And then if you go to another place that has even more mineral content in their water, like California, it's going to extract even more and taste more and more roasty. So you either have to do a massive brew adjustment, or you have to change the way you're roasting in order to get that to work. So you might taste coffee from somewhere else. You might buy a bag of coffee, have it shipped to you. You might taste it and be like, man, these people are underdeveloping the hell out of their coffee. Like, what is wrong with them? This tastes like pea soup. But what's probably happening is they actually have a higher mineral content in their local water supply. And so for them, it's not underdeveloped at all. But we've just made a judgment call, and I do this too. You make a judgment call about what somebody else is doing and how they're not doing it right, but really they're doing it right for them. But they weren't actually caring too much about you and your water supply because you're not their main customer base. Like, most of our coffee is sold in Portland, Oregon. Sorry, we're not taking into consideration people in California that have 350 parts per million in the water. We're just not. You have to make a brew adjustment for that. So
I'll add to this that this is a great sales tool, coming from a sales guy. This is a great sales tool for you roasters out there to talk to your local cafes and say, we're roasting for the water that you have in this area. We have the same water, so our roast profile is on point for what you have in your cafe. If you're getting coffee from across the country from a whole different source, they're roasting for what they're tasting in their lab, and that may not be appropriate for what we're tasting here. And furthermore, selling to they may say to that, oh, well, we have filtration, all of that, but their customers don't. Your home users don't generally. So if you're wanting to sell whole bean coffee, it's really important, and I've said this before, it's really important that you taste your coffee through a home brewing system, that you taste your coffee through your city water and see what somebody that's buying your coffee is tasting. If you don't know what they're buying, if you don't know what they're going to taste, then you're not roasting coffee for that customer. You're roasting coffee for your lab. And our customers are not lab rats. They're real human beings out in the real world with real world problems, and your coffee shouldn't be one of them. So roast your coffee according to how your customers are going to be drinking that. Taste your coffee through your brewers. Taste your coffee through, if you're serving French press in your cafes, you better be French pressing that coffee on the bar and evaluating your roast through that medium. It's very, very important.
Yeah.
Any other questions out there? Yes, sir, in the back.
I appreciate the point of having your sample roaster match your production roaster. Any experience tips, advice on electric sample roasters with a gas production roaster, or vice versa?
Yeah, so the question is, he appreciates the point of having a similar sample roaster to your production roaster. Are there any tips if that sample roaster might be electric and your production roaster gas, or vice versa? Any thoughts on that?
first of all, electric boogie woogie woogie. That's just in my brain, and I'm sorry about that.
Don't apologize.
Yeah.
Don't apologize.
There's a lot of things that I find humorous that aren't. But anyway, no, it's a great question. So this is where I may deviate from certain people in terms of how I conceptualize coffee roasting. There is, and it's not going to be very romantic sounding or difficult sounding, so I apologize for that too. It would be more great if it was like more mysterious, I think. But there's so much off-gassing off of coffee when it's being roasted, and there's so much pushing out that I highly doubt that the heat source that you're using plays that big of a role impacting the actual chemical composition throughout the bean. I would even suggest maybe even at the surface of the bean it doesn't play that large of a role, but it certainly doesn't beyond the surface, which is just a relatively small area. When I'm trying to match profiles between roasting machines, and I've done this so many times and it's so much fun to do, basically what you do is you just line up all of those events that you can note. When did it turn pale? When did it turn yellow? When did it turn brown? When did I hit first crack? when did I come out and at what color did I come out of the roast? And for the most part, if you're able to line your roasters up, the curves will look totally different, so don't even pay a bit of attention to that. They can even look totally different on the same manufacturer of machine at different sizes, so literally just don't look at the graph, actually physically watch the coffee. And if you can get it to line up, most people are hard-pressed to taste any difference between the two different roasts. And we've done that across different roasting platforms, different roasting sizes. My favorite time we did it is there was a cupping team of about 10 people, and they couldn't tell if the coffee that I had roasted, or the coffee that was on the table was from their production line or our production line. I'm good friends with their director of coffee, and he brought their coffee to my shop, and we roasted it to their specs, and they couldn't taste the difference. Totally different roasting machines, and it was fantastic. So I think that a lot of what happens with roasters is more just like, okay, the roaster will tend to naturally do this, and so most people naturally have this kind of a profile off this type of roaster. But if you pay attention to those color change markers, those events like first crack, the color, whole bean and ground, just ground isn't good enough on its own, but whole bean and ground to make sure your development time's in spec, then you can match between different machines of different burner types, totally different machine setups, and you can get good results off that. So transitioning from your electric sample roaster to your gas roaster, you may have faster response time on your gas sample roaster, so you might have to dial some of that back a little bit if you're trying to match your electric entirely. But other than that, yeah, just don't look at the graph, look at the beans, and make them match up, and you'll have a good time, I think.
What I would add to that is if you are in your production roaster doing 80% batches or 50% batches, then on your sample roaster doing an 80% batch or a 50% batch is way more important than whether it's electric or whether it's gas.
Boogie, boogie,
Having that similarity of batch to system is a much more important thing than where the heat's coming from. Heat is heat. BTUs are BTUs. So whether they come from an electric source or a gas source is really not important. It's how they're imported to the coffee. How does the coffee absorb those BTUs, and how does the coffee change? If your rate of change is the same between two different systems, then that rate of change is going to result in the exact same or very similar to the exact same chemical reactions at the same time. So it's all about those reactions. Those reactions are what you're going after. The tools are there for you to invoke those reactions onto your coffee and then repeat those reactions in a way that is helpful and user-friendly. All right? Does that make sense? Did that answer your question?
It does, yeah.
Okay, good.
Cool.
All that to say, it doesn't really matter. Yes, question right
Question
here.
regarding airflow. So I have I think it was called a manometer or manometer or whatever.
Uh-huh.
Was it the vacuum in the chamber?
Phenomena.
So, and I also have a variable speed drive on the fan. So before I would kind of keep it a constant. I would adjust the damper.
Uh-huh.
And so I wanted to know what the differences were to achieving say 0.25 inches of water by a damper adjustment or by using the variable drive. What's the taste implications? Because I think I knew that there was some kind of back pressure, but I kind of wasn't paying attention. And I was talking to Nick here, and he brought it back up again. So now it's on the front of my mind again. Can you say what are the differences between, even though you have the same, you might be reading the same number,
Yeah.
what the differences are if you're using a damper to achieve that number, or if you're using the fan speed itself on a variable drive to achieve it?
Where's the manometer?
The question, hold on.
it's-
Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
It's on the airflow.
On the exit past the circ fan?
Before this, so the fan's pulling through, so it comes out of the drum,
Yeah.
and the fan's about here, so it pulls out. And
Okay. So it's between the drum and the circ fan.
yeah,
Correct.
Okay, cool.
So the question is there a difference if your pressure stat is reading 25 inches of water and it's driven to that 25 point,
0.25, right?
or 0.25, sorry. If it's driven to that point through fan speed or if it's driven to that point through a damper, is there a difference?
So this is where you and I will probably disagree, actually.
Okay.
Joe and I were joking that we tend to end up agreeing, like we'll start trying to argue with each other and then we're both on the same side. So doesn't last very long. But so I don't think that unless you have back pressure and it's holding smoke inside the chamber, I don't think that using the damper or the fan speed is actually going to cause a flavor difference. I've matched profiles between a old style Probat UG and a Loring Smart Roast, which are very, very different in terms of the amount of CFM airflow movement they're doing. One's recirculating, the other's single pass. And I've matched it so a cupping team of 10 people literally could not taste the difference between them. The air that's flowing over the surface of the bean doesn't impact the bean as much as we think it does. It might affect the surface a little bit, but what it has more to do with so far as is actual heat transfer and roast speed. So higher airflow because convection is over 70% of the roasting process. Like even an old school Probat, the president of Probat was like, yeah, it's 70-30, 70% convection, only 30% conduction. So we get in our heads worked out that it's so much more conduction than it is anything, but actually roasting is primarily convection in all machines. Mm-hmm. And so the difference that you're having between, assuming that the profile stays exactly the same, your end color is the same, development time is the same, all that is held static, an adjustment to the airflow won't make a massive difference unless you're doing something dynamically different. There's also a Swiss researcher that did online free radical observations where they were looking at oxidation at the bean level, whether they were blasting it with normal atmospheric air or pure nitrogen. And they found that because the bean is pushing out so much, there was no difference in the way that oxidation occurred, regardless of whether it was nitrogen or full airflow, because of the outward force of the bean. Until they went into cooling, and when those reactions subsided and the pressure went away, then there was a massive difference. So for us, in general, when it comes to roasting, I don't think airflow is going to make a huge difference if your profile is the same.
And what I will say to that is, I'm so sorry to tell you this, but I 100% agree with you.
We almost had something.
The question for me is, do you not have a pressure gauge? And if you do not have a pressure gauge, then it will make a very big difference if you're using a damper versus fan. And this is why. If you're using a damper and you turn your damper to 50% off, what air does is air will squish around your damper and still go through at a very high rate. Mm-hmm. So you don't really know what your pressure is. You feel like you're at 50% air, but you're really still probably at 75% air. So if you have a fan speed adjustment, then you can repeatably and measurably hit the same exact cubic feet of air moving through your system. However, if you have a pressure gauge, a manometer, then you can measure the pressure in the drum, and then it no longer matters whether it's fan speed or whether it's a damper. But your damper at 50% is going to probably look like it's almost 70% closed. That's where dampers kind of give you a false reading. Most roasters don't have pressure gauge on the machine. Yep. Most roasters do have a damper, and so when a roaster is dampening that coffee and they're like 25% closed, they're still fully open. That still has full pressure. It still has full convection. That's why I tend to prefer for most roasters machines to have fan speed control, because fan speed control, when I want zero air, I can literally have zero air because I turn the fan off, which is probably a dangerous thing to do.
Yeah.
But if I want 100% air, I can have that fan at 100%. But even still, if I'm at 100%, what does 100% mean? It's 100% capacity for that fan, for that machine, for those pipes, with that volume of coffee, all of these other things, for that tall of a stack, for that width of stack piping.
The temperature difference inside to outside.
Totally. There are all of these other things. So that's why it's so important to think about your system, what your system has on it, what tastes good out of your system first and foremost, and then can you repeat that good flavor experience time after time?
Yeah, I would agree. I like the idea of using a variable speed more than a damper at this point. I also leave my airflow static like 90% of the time and just control with burner, which doesn't sound like you want to see somebody like pulling levers and moving stuff. But I wonder, we won't have time to go. Is it cool if I draw on the board real quick?
Do we have a board?
No, it's right there. I just don't want it to be too far off. Can I draw on the board? Cool. So this is the way I conceptualize it. I'm a visual person. And I like bell curves a lot because I think it's a little bit more realistic. And for those of you who can't see, I'll just leave it up and try and describe it with my hand motions as well. So
Bell curve.
there's a certain percentage at your optimal airflow for your burner. There are two things that are going to be in balance, okay? Can your burner put out enough BTU to handle the cubic feet of air that you're moving through it, right? So for some roasters, the burner is just not powerful enough for their max fan speed. And so your most efficient means of heat transfer might be 70% airflow, or it might be 50% airflow. It all just depends on that setup. So I like to think of it in terms of like sound stuff, like gain versus volume. So when you are at your optimal airflow for whatever that is for your machine, you have the largest bandwidth for your burner adjustment. So if I'm at 100% burner at my optimum airflow, I have the maximum amount of burner that I can move through. I'm transferring the most amount of heat I can to the beans while roasting. Now, when I'm at a high airflow rate, any adjustment that I make to the burner has a larger repercussion in terms of the actual heat I'm transferring to the coffee. If I'm at 100% airflow and I turn my burner down 25%, it's an exponentially larger difference in the amount of heat transfer I'm having than if I am at a non-optimal or a not as fast airflow rate, where my 100% is lower, but it compresses the line, and my 75% isn't as, now that's a bad example, let me move that line up here. And my 75% turn down isn't as big of a difference in terms of the amount of heat that I'm applying to the beans. Does that make sense? So like if you think about it in terms of that, so I've got this line of spectrum on my burner, where 100% and 0%. As I move down the side of the bell curve, that flattens out a little bit. And so when my airflow is lower, my maximum burner is doing less for me in terms of transferring heat to the coffee beans, but any adjustment I make makes a smaller difference in the amount of heat that I'm actually applying to the coffee. So for me, I just find my optimal airflow on a roaster, and then I don't really fiddle with it, which sounds so bad, doesn't it? It sounds so non-technical, like I'm not constantly adjusting everything. But the best way to be repeatable is to eliminate the number of variables that you have in terms of what you have to adjust. So once I find my optimal burner rate, and I do that by wasting a whole bunch of lower grade coffee and then donating it to 501c3 charities. But basically, turn some beans brown at different airflow rates, find out where you get your fastest roast, and that's likely going to be your optimal airflow for your heat transfer. Then when you make burner adjustments, you just need to learn what burner settings you're adjusting up and down to. So I might not ever go below 25 or 20% when I'm in first crack, depending on the roaster and the construction of the roaster and how much heat it has retained in it, because 25% might be very low in terms of the actual heat transfer of the beans after first. But that's all roaster dependent. Anyway, all that to say, if you give yourself the largest bandwidth, then you can make burner adjustments and have that be sufficient and get the same great taste out of your coffee without really worrying about it.
Yeah.
That's a lot of words, sorry.
And this is what, whenever I'm on the videos and I'm talking about something being 100% for that roast or for that batch, this is kind of what I'm referring to. So for instance, if you're on a roaster and you're doing 50% capacity and your gas can turn up to 7 or 11, if it can turn
Goes
up
to 11.
Then if your gas can only go to 7 bars, but you're at 50% capacity, 100% gas for that roast is probably at 5, or not bars, inches. It's probably at 5.
Yep.
Okay, something like that. So then you want to think about a bell curve for that particular roast. What is going to be your 100% airflow if 100% of your gas is only at 5 inches and you're doing 50% capacity? And then you treat that like your this is now the realm of gas that I will use between 1 and 5 for this roast. Things like that. Simplify the process. If you can simplify the process, you can repeat the process. Mm-hmm. And furthermore, you can teach somebody else the process so that you're not the one stuck roasting all of the time. If you have like all of these crazy things in your roasting and all of these little tricks, it's not repeatable. You're probably not doing what you think you're doing, and it's definitely not teachable.
Yeah. So we didn't fight.
No, not
nope.
yet.
All right.
So far, so
Let's
good.
keep them coming.
Yeah. Guys,
does that make sense to everybody, though?
Not yet, but sure.
We'll find
Yeah,
it.
and some of this stuff may take a few times. Like, go back, watch this again, ask us questions again. It'll take some time to go deep into that cerebral cortex. Yes?
As somebody new, like purchasing green coffee from an importer like yourself, like he was real big on like times when stuff happens and charting it all. Obviously, you guys have a cup of coffee that you're supposed to buy already. Is that something as like a new purchaser could ask? Like when did you guys see those things happen so we could try to match that when we get the coffee at our facility?
So the question is, when using an importer who is doing all of these sample batches, is it appropriate or is it helpful to ask when certain reactions took place within their sample roasting protocol? The answer, unfortunately, is it's not very helpful because when we're doing a sample batch, we're bringing everything to the exact same roast because we're not looking for the potential flavor in coffee. We're looking for the potential taints in coffee. We're looking for negative flavor profiles. So we want to be a sieve to sieve out and filter out all of the bad stuff that you never want to taste. So for that purpose, we have to roast all coffees very, very light. We have an automated roasting system that we're not monitoring every single roast. We are, if we get a bad roast, we just pitch that coffee and try again on a second sample. And maybe make a small adjustment for that. So we have a range of different profiles that we use for all coffees across all spectrums in our system. That said, a good importer should then be able to extrapolate where the coffee came from, what the processing is, what your use for that is, what your roaster is, and whether or not these coffees will fit into the category that you need, and give you some general insights into, yeah, this, for the purpose that you're using, this coffee is appropriate. I would go for a roast somewhat like this in your system. So that's what I do day in, day out, is kind of troubleshoot with customers on different systems. And that is not an exact science, At the end of the day, you're going to be the expert on your machine. So again, that's why at the end of the day, I will say you should sample this and see whether it will work in your program and you taste it for yourself. That's why I say, sure, you can get cupping notes off of our website, but you should never use those as a profile description for your customers because it's not your roast, it's not your water, it's not your brewer. This is cupping. If you're seeing nutty, grassy, herbal, tart, citric notes on our website, it's because we're roasting the coffee as light as we possibly can to keep it soluble enough to taste defects. So you can make it taste way better than our sample roaster is.
Also, a fun story about tasting notes for customers. Be wary of what you put on the bag because we've had a lot of fun experiences where we get angry calls from restaurateurs being like, "You put nuts in my coffee? I'm allergic to nuts." Just when it backfires. Or tobacco. If you put tobacco as a tasting note, you'll get a lot of anti-tobacco people being like, "I don't freaking do tobacco, you kidding me?" So be wary with how you phrase what it is and make sure the word tasting notes is large, perhaps. I think we had it smaller once and it was like a no-go. But
My soapbox on this platform is if I were to own a roasting company, first I would probably not be very successful because I can't stay in one place at one time and roast over and over and over. I just can't do that. But I would use phrases on my bags to say something like, if you like pecan pie, you'll love this coffee. If you like a Snickers bar, this is the coffee for you. So you make correlations and you don't necessarily promise the customer, you will taste this in this coffee. But it's more of like an invitation into something you enjoy. That's my style whenever it comes to that. Do we have any questions from the home audience at all?
We have mostly just wants for you guys to keep talking.
Okay, cool.
about anything?
And we do have a microphone and a camera if you guys do want to.
Oh, look at that, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
you guys
great.
want to do a more structured Q&A?
Yeah, you can
It's been fine.
queue up if you want, or
Great.
Queue up for the Q&A.
there you go.
Can you
Question.
say something about the moisture content in coffee and how that impacts your plan to roast?
So I believe that we look at moisture content very wrongly in coffee. So for instance, if you have a balloon and the balloon is this big, okay, and it's 10% moisture, and you have another balloon that's this big, that's 10% moisture, which one is more moist? Which one has more moisture? The larger balloon. So if you're looking at coffee and the coffee is very low density, very low grown, very soft bean, and it's reading on your moisture meter 10%, and then you have another coffee that is very dense, very high grown, very large bean, and it's reading 10%. That hard bean has much more moisture, but it's still reading on your moisture meter the same. So if you only extrapolate information on how to roast that coffee by only looking at that one data point, you're going to roast that coffee poorly. So roasting is not just about one piece of data. It's important to measure the moisture. Moisture is more of a point of data for quality control in terms of how the green coffee will degrade over time, whether or not it will mold, whether or not it's going to fall apart and taste like a age defect taint. So yeah, I'm going to try to say taint as many times as I can today. So
you're reading my mind.
If you only look at that, you'll do things wrong. If you track that, though, you do develop certain patterns. So, for instance, if on one coffee you have 10% moisture, and then a month from now you measure that coffee and it's 12% moisture, that should change the way that you approach that coffee. Because now you know by nature of it having more moisture, it's going to absorb energy differently. But it's only for that one coffee. If you're only looking at percentages, those percentages are only giving you one part of an equation. And that equation is a lot bigger than that. The equation is bean size, bean density, bean type, what kind of processing took place on that coffee, batch size, all of these other features. So I don't take stock in moisture percentage. I think that from a roaster perspective, that would probably be the last tool that I would buy as far as a quality control tool, because you need to be at a pretty high volume of coffee that you're roasting and storing for a long amount of time for that data to make sense for you. As an importer, on the other hand, we measure density, we measure moisture content, we measure water activity, we measure the agtron of the roasted coffee inside and outside, all for quality control purposes to track change in coffee over time so that we're more and more accurate in the coffees that we buy and how shelf stable those coffees will be. There's nothing worse than getting a brand new fresh coffee and it tastes agey already. We prevent that. Our coffees won't taste agey because we have data to support our buying practices in water activity, moisture content. But there is a trend out there right now that says higher water activity coffees go through Maillard reaction better. That's false. We have 20,000 data points to support that that is actually false information. Your water activity actually changes the instant that it goes into the drum. Your water activity is going to alter considerably due to heat taking place. So for instance, water activity, for instance, is like if you have two different sponges, one sponge is very porous, one sponge is very dense. You put water on both of them, that porous sponge is going to have higher water activity. The water will leave it much more quickly, whereas your dense sponge will hold water much longer. Well, if all of a sudden you take that dense sponge and you squeeze it, now it has way more water activity than the sponge that you haven't squeezed yet. So as you put coffee in a roaster, it's kind of like squeezing the sponge. So now your water activity is totally different, and we don't have a tool to measure what the water activity is during a roast profile. So even water activity is not something that I would look at all for a roast profile. We have data sets showing that even within distinct origin, distinct processing style, and exact same water activities, there are variations in roast due to other factors like density, bean size, things like that. So density for me is a really important factor, but even still, if I only look at density and don't look at bean size, I can have a very dense, tiny mocha variety from Yemen, and if it's super dense, it may roast the same as a large Pacamara that's not dense at all, because the density per bean size has canceled those two things out. So look at bean size, and at the end of the day, you know my golden rule: do it taste good. So if it's a smiley face at the end of the roast, then you've done it right. So water activity is not necessarily going to give you a smiley face or a frown. It is an important data point as you are growing, but don't get caught up in those details. How do you feel about it?
Well, I'm not an expert on the issue by any means. I think if you're doing any sort of direct trade, having a moisture meter is going to be a fantastic resource, just to be able to check and keep an eye on it. And for storage conditions as well, just to make sure that your storage conditions are adequate. So, you know, there are a lot of pieces of equipment that people are vying for us to get when it comes to lab equipment for roasting, and there's a lot of successful roasteries that do have them, and there's a lot of successful roasteries that don't have them. I do pay a little bit more attention to density and altitude of growth, only because that's a really easy metric to just glance at and generally have an idea of whether it is going to tend to be a little bit more or less dense, just kind of as a ballpark figure. I don't really pay as much attention to the moisture content in terms of like, am I going to make a specific roast just for that? But I do take very diligent notes during my first roast as to how the moisture seems to be changing during the course of the roast. And this is all just kind of
very important.
As a, you know, it's not scientific in any way, but you know, there's one coffee we have, for example, that once it starts going to browning reactions, it's going to just try and dog and fall off on me because there's a lot of water vapor escaping or being generated by the Maillard reactions, which sometimes for me is linked with higher altitude growth because higher altitude has been linked with more amino acid content in the coffee, and amino acids are a catalyst for the Maillard reaction, so it's potentially reacting more vigorously, maybe. I wish I had an inline gas chromatograph because that would be dope. But you know, what's happening is it starts to dog off, and I know with that coffee, okay, I need to push it a little bit more through browning. Similar things will happen after first crack, depending on the coffee. One will just take off wildly, and one will kind of chill out, and you have to push a lot more heat on it. And there's different reasons why that may be. I have heard an interesting link. It was, I forget who, I think maybe it was Joel from, anyway, they suggested, I can't remember the name of the, I'll remember it later. But had a connection with water activity and how crazy a first crack is going to happen. And I found that interesting because it wasn't making a claim of like anything chemically. It was just saying, okay, what I've noted is coffees with a higher water activity tend to run away on me at first crack, and coffees with a lower water activity tend to be able to apply a little bit more heat after first, and they're okay with that. Which was, I like how that feels. I can't spend $2,500 to learn that myself yet at our roastery in our lab because even the cheaper water activity meters are quite expensive. So, you know, for me, it's just a test roast in my sample roaster, and I'm wasting maybe 2 kilos of coffee max, which is going to be, what is that, 4 times, so $12, $13 or so, depending on the coffee, or more, depending. So I probably did the math horribly wrong on that. But anyway, it's not nearly as expensive as doing it that way, and you learn a lot more about the coffee in general. So I would just say test roast and like have a standard that you do a test roast with, and noting that might give you better insights into how to design the profile for that particular coffee, even more than instrumentation might. So.
Yeah, and for the water activity studies that I'm talking about, we're hoping to release a pretty extensive study. I think we're probably going to do it through Roast Magazine at some point in the future, but there's so much data we're still trying to process through it right now. I want to say we're 5 years into our study. So what we do is we measure water activity on the offer sample, water activity in all, moisture, everything. But water activity is of particular interest to me and us. We measure it on the offer sample, the pre-shipment sample, the arrival sample, and then if the coffee's in our warehouse for any certain amount of time, every 3 months or so, we'll take another measure, take another sample. In particular, we'll choose particular coffees for the study. We've also had temperature gauges, humidity gauges at farm level, at patio level, in the containers as they travel, and see kind of how things change over time due to temperature, due to all kinds of other conditions. So Yeah, it's going to be interesting when it gets released, but what I can tell you is that it doesn't really matter so much in roasting. That's like what we can draw a pretty clear thing from. Yes, Ian.
I would want some clarification on an earlier question
Mhm.
about or discussion about transferring a roast profile from one roaster to another,
Mhm.
from a sample roaster to a production roaster. Were you suggesting that if you match same time and color and phase times
Mhm.
and color between roasters, that you'll get a similar result? For instance, going from a 500-gram wood roaster to a 25-kilo cast iron roaster, are you saying that the development times, if you do a
Mhm.
12-minute roast on the small roaster and a 12-minute roast on the large roaster, you're going to get the same output?
So for those at home, the question is, if we match the times for color changes, and this is a clarification question, times of color changes and whole bean and ground color and development time and all that sort of stuff between two very different roasters, like a North roaster and an old Probot, at various different batch sizes, do we get the same results? So that's the question. In my opinion and in my experience, the answer is yes. It usually ends up a bit more difficult than it sounds because you want to make sure that you're within a point or two on color, both whole bean and ground, your development times within a couple seconds. And all the, basically aim for like within 5 seconds consistency on all those to get them quite close. You might have one or two people that feel like they can taste the difference, but in general, in larger panels, they can't reliably tell the difference, and for consumer studies, they can't tell the difference.
And let me clarify a little further too. When we're talking about having the same like benchmark points, we're talking specifically, does this turn yellow at the exact same time? Does this turn gold at the exact same time? Is first crack at the exact same time? You may need to use different gas settings, different air settings, different things like that for each roaster in order to create not the same curve, because the curve's also going to look very different, but the exact same time that each chemical reaction is taking place. So if you think about coffee as having the potential for certain chemical reactions, then the time and reaction, those two things are going to be perpendicular and they need to intersect. So time and reaction means that coffee is at the same temperature, regardless of what your temperature probe says, at the same time for the same reaction in two different drums. So that should create the same chemical reaction, which should create the same flavonoid in the coffee. And the same flavonoid is the same taste experience that you'll have from each coffee.
Yeah, the caveat to that is there are, because of heat transfer capabilities in different machines, there are times when you can roast a coffee in a certain way on one machine that is not possible to be replicated
Correct.
on another machine, just because it may or may not have the horsepower to actually get the job done, or the ability to cool off fast enough. So like if you're roasting on a really like heavy cast iron machine, and you're just cranking and pushing and pushing and pushing, and then you plan to let off and do a 3-minute development time to a very light roast level, it's probably just not going to happen. Just because I have driven a Chevy Cavalier doesn't mean I can drive a Tesla in the same fashion. Well, I could drive a Tesla like a Chevy Cavalier. My Chevy Cavalier is not going to be able to accelerate like the Tesla can, period.
Yeah.
So there are certain caveats with that. So that's why making sure, like if you're talking about like a 500-gram North where you're sample roasting or doing profile development, making sure that you're sticking within a range you know you can actually reproduce on your larger roaster is very important. Because if you fall in love with a really fast roast and you're never going to be able to do that at a full batch on your large machine, then you're wasting a lot of production time with that. So try and fall in love with coffees that you can reasonably roast. Or if you need to change your machinery in order to roast in a certain profile that you like with a larger batch size, then that's acceptable also. But just make sure that you kind of are aware. And if I can diverge, does that satisfy at least the clarification? Sweet.
I think there is a section out there, and I don't know if this is 100%,
Mm-hmm.
but
Right. And
So it's like that 500 grams is going to be developed in a quicker time, where the heat is going to transfer through that smaller mass quicker,
mhm.
and therefore it might produce a similar result in a shorter roast time
Mm.
than a larger mass, physical mass, in a larger roaster at a longer time.
I think that the key that you're missing here is that, so the analogy that was made is like a thick steak. You're not going to cook a thick steak the same way that you cook a thin steak. So different amounts of masses should have different types of heat evoked upon them. So that would result in different times for the same flavor output. I do not disagree with you on that. What I think though that you're missing here is, if I have 500 grams of coffee and I try to get it to yellow, first crack, drop temp, all of the chemical reactions in the same amount of time as 500 kilos of coffee, and I put that 500 grams of coffee into the 500 kilo machine, then it's not possible. What we're talking about is a system that has the same exact capabilities to evoke the same chemical reactions at the same points on different batch sizes of coffee. So for instance, in your 1 kilo machine, doing it to 1 kilo, on your 20 kilo machine, doing it to 20 kilos. If the system matches the quantity, then you can evoke the exact same roast profile across multiple different systems.
Well, and my thought too is just that the beans aren't a mass. The beans are individuals. And so like, basically with the majority of heat transfer being convection in pretty much all roasting machines, what happens is the beans are actually lofted up into the airflow, and each one of them experiences the airflow individually. So even though there is a mass at the bottom that may be larger or smaller depending on the batch size, the actual majority of the heat transfer is a very individual experience of the beans being thrown up into the airflow. In addition to that, each one of them is taking on conductive heat from each other, and so you would have to drive it very differently depending on what batch size, but you can get a match in between various batch sizes on the same basic profile, essentially, and get the same flavor results in the same length of time. So for me, and you know, there's no scientific data either way, so I don't take a hard line on it, but like for me, if I'm going to try and match flavor, I'm matching flavor with considering each bean as an individual player and not as a collective unit. And so I'm trying to get those beans' experience to be the same, whether it's in a 500 kilo mass or a 500 gram mass. And what we've experienced in terms of the cupping results is that people just can't taste any difference between them, which is, you know, for the most part, kind of rubber meets the road fine for me. Now, whether or not they would come out different on a mass spec would be interesting, but you know, then you got the problem with the mass spec is that you might see a large spike, but it's an imperceptible flavor compound, and you might have an imperceptible spike that we can't even see the difference of. That's a massive perception difference. So, you know, if it tastes the same, I think it works out. And I would recommend trying doing it the exact same way, and then if that doesn't work, playing around with variables could be a function. Yeah. So.
And I'm going to take a little different route off of something you said. I do think about all of the coffee as being one mass. I do think about all of the coffee as being individual. It's important to understand both. It's important to understand that if when you're roasting, all of your coffee drops out and it looks very different, like you have different degrees of roast, there is something wrong. That you are, and I see this actually more in higher convection, or higher conduction than I do in higher convection. Convection can even out the roast much faster. So for instance, if you have a drum that slows way down and your coffee kind of just rests, more conduction will add more difference in depth of roast than more convection will. Convection evens everything out. And when those beans, like when one coffee seed takes on too much heat and then it touches another coffee seed, it'll give, the cooler seed is always thirsty for heat. So the coolness absorbs heat. Heat is always absorbed by something else. So there is heat diffusion in your mass, but there's less heat diffusion if you have more conduction. So for instance, if you were to just turn your airflow off entirely and roast coffee, you would see that there are some beans that are much more roasted than other beans. Or you see this also if you have
Ventilation blockage.
ventilation blockage, if you've accidentally overloaded your roaster You'll see a lot of variation because now there's less convection because you're plugging that convection up. You see it if your if your drum is too long. Some machines out there have been manufactured to be too long and too tight, like a tube. So if that's the case, you get a lot more conduction time because it's not moving the coffee from front to back as evenly in the drum. So conduction is, again, a less efficient way of heating, and it also doesn't diffuse throughout the mass as much. So convection also is cool in that it helps with the diffusion of heat, and it helps with the individual bean. Each individual bean will roast better. But understanding both and is a really important thing.
Yep. Old school RP class or roasting class from the SCA, the history of roasting, touches on a really fantastic topic, and that's the innovation of convection in roasting, which was 1800s, 1900s?
Really close to the 1900s.
Yeah, really close to 1900s.
Late 1800s.
So before then, they actually had to keep batch sizes small, and roast times were still fairly long, like 20 to 30 minutes, even with small batch sizes, because they couldn't, through conduction, generate enough heat to appropriately roast the coffee. I mean, there were also other problems, like there wasn't any convection in the cooling either. They just had a cart and dumped it out into the cart and then raked it around a little bit, and that was it. But
no electricity.
Oh, yeah. Belt-driven, you know.
Yeah, some of it was belt-driven. A lot of them, you see these dudes that are like, and all the pictures are dudes, you see them straddling a hot roaster.
In a full wool
and
suit.
turning it. Yeah, and like these wool, like army men
It looks awful.
things.
Yeah.
We've come a long way.
Yeah.
Come a long way.
Yeah.
But electricity, that introduced belt-driven. There were some roasters that were plugged into different kinds of water mills and things like that, but that was pretty rare. So you see, instead of like today where you walk into a roasting plant and you see a giant machine and maybe a second size machine and a sample roaster, back then you would see a line of 50 machines with 50 men operating them, full suits.
A lot of smoke.
So much smoke.
A lot of smoke.
Pretty crazy.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. John.
Oh, hey.
Hey.
So I've been,
Thanks for being here, by the way.
Oh, no. So I've been traveling around the orchard quite a bit, looking at like roasting at higher elevations and saying like, how can these, how can they capture more value in origin? So I'm wondering like, you should roast coffee origin and ship it. And obviously it's like 3 or 4 days for shipment, but a lot of the, the pushback is, well, in 1,800 meters or like 1,200 meters. And so I don't have a good answer. So like, it's usually like a half-hour roast profile. So is there a way to, have you seen really good roast profiles of origin at higher elevations or even in Denver? And like, what do they do differently? And how does all this information be impacted by that elevation?
I think the brunt of this question is how does elevation and mainly environmental pressure affect the roast profile, and are there any good tools out there to help defer that pressure variance, that external to the drum pressure variance?
Yeah, it basically reduces your power output. The air is not dense enough. It can't carry as much heat. You don't have as much oxygen coming through, especially if you're using a power burner where you've got oxygen being forced into combustion with the gas. So you might get partial combustion or might have to change your balance quite a bit to get full combustion. But you're losing the ability to transfer heat. And so a lot of times what people at elevation have to do is just reduce their batch size. On a lot of these roasters too, it's not just that they have to reduce their batch size, because I'm with you there. I've been to Origin and seen the roasting, and one of the profile matches I had to do was somebody looking to get a modern roaster that wanted to mimic their 42-minute roast time, which is very challenging to do, let me tell you, on a modern machine. But part of it's they don't have enough convection. Normally they're doing direct flame driven, and they're not utilizing convection as well as they could. So kind of helping them understand, like, hey, you need a burner that's got enough BTU output. It's going to get the airflow hot enough when you're sending it through to actually do some work on the coffee roasting. Maybe moving the flames a little further away from the drum so that extra heat in the hot box isn't causing charring, because sometimes those home-built roasters don't have really good quality metal, and hot spots form pretty easily. So focusing a lot more on having them use convective heat as well as being augmented by some conduction is probably going to be very beneficial. I've roasted on modern machines at Origin at altitude, and another issue they face is that oftentimes the gas companies aren't completely honest with the mixture, and it isn't quite 100% propane, butane, or whatever it is. So they have issues with impurities, and so they have a lower BTU output in general. So oversize your roaster, undersize your batches, and introduce a lot of convection would probably be the best ways. And if you can get pure gas supplies, then do that as well. But yeah, there was once we had this roaster, we dialed it in even, and the flame was just green. It was a beautiful lime green, but it couldn't get it out. Yeah.
So then electricity?
Yeah, that's what I was going to
Yeah,
say.
electric
This is a
roasters,
great
but then
opportunity
rolling
for
blackouts
electricity.
too.
Yeah,
So,
I mean,
but that hurts
generator-
both. So,
generators with electricity, something like that. But I would do the pushback of green coffee is a lot more stable than roasted coffee, and a lot of roasted coffee is going to export very differently than unroasted coffee, because unroasted coffee looks like a raw product, whereas roasted coffee is a finished food product. So that finishing of the food product, if you have a finished food product that you're trying to export, and import, there are a lot of different rules around that kind of thing. So food safety comes into effect. Then instead of using burlap, they'll have to use, high-end bags, small bags, a lot more time spent on a line, filling those bags, sealing those bags, all of that. So then your costs go way up. But I think there's room, especially within coffee growing countries, to do more roasting for that community within the country. I'm seeing a lot of growth in that sector. You can go to most Central American, South American cities and get world-class coffee in cafes. Yeah, it's a challenge. Roasting at altitude is certainly a challenge. The other thing that I would say is having a closed system is a helpful tool. So especially on larger batches. So for altitude, I recommend a smaller machine in general, because then you need less oxygen to keep that BTU at the same rate. But then if you can have a closed system of some kind that maintains pressure within the system, you'll probably get a lot better results. I know I've seen that from people that are roasting at altitude here in the US. Any questions from the home audience?
pressurize the room.
Yeah, room pressure.
No.